Good evening, everybody.
Evening.
I hate this microphone thing. I'm going to try it out. Can you hear me?
Yeah.
Yes. Hello, everybody. My name's Jane Wood, and I'm Philip's editor at Quercus. First, I want to say thank you so much for coming to help us celebrate Metropolis, Philip's new novel, and also Philip himself and his fantastic talent. And it was a rare talent, and I've been his editor for 10 years, and the great treat of the year was when Philip would deliver a new manuscript, always on time, needing hardly any work at all, total joy to an editor. Another wonderful thing about being Phil's editor was lunch. I mean, we don't have lunch in publishing anymore, but Philip and I had lunch. This involved alcohol and, lots of food and a lot of laughter. He was the best lunch companion, as I'm sure all of you have had lunch with him know. Erudite, witty, absolutely huge fun. Anyway, Jane and Howard are going to talk about Philip, and as his editor, I feel that I should be talking about the book. So I want to talk to you about Metropolis, which was his last novel, his last Bernie Gunther novel. It's set in 1928, the Weimar Republic, which is earlier than anything that Philip ever wrote, and Hitler's not yet come to power, and the shadow of the First World War is still dark. I'm just going to read part of the prologue to Metropolis because it gives you a wonderful taster of a fantastic novel written with such energy in the most difficult circumstances. So it's a rare book. Here we go, prologue to Metropolis. Like anyone who's read the Bible, I was familiar with the idea of Babylon as a city that was a byword for iniquity and the abominations of the earth, whatever they might be. And like anyone who lived in Berlin during the Weimar Republic, I was also familiar with the comparison frequently made between the two cities. At the Lutheran St. Nicholas's Church in Berlin, where I used to go with my parents as a small boy, our brick-faced, shouty pastor, Dr. Bockford, seemed so familiar with Babylon and its topography that I believed he must once have lived there, which only provoked my fascination with the name and prompted me to look it up in the Conversations lexicon, which occupied a whole shelf in the family bookcase. The encyclopedia wasn't very enlightening on the abominations, and while it's true there were plenty of whores and scarlet women and an ample supply of sin to be found in Berlin, I'm not sure it was worse than any other great metropolis such as London, New York or Shanghai. Bernard Weiss told me that the comparison was and always had been nonsense, that it was like comparing apples with oranges. He didn't believe in evil and reminded me that there were no laws against it anywhere, not even in England, where they have laws against almost everything. In May 1928, the famous Ishtar Gate, the northern entrance to Babylon, had yet to be reconstructed in Berlin's Pergamon Museum. So the Prussian capital's notoriety as the wickedest place in the world had yet to be underlined and read by the city's moral guardians, meaning there was still some room for doubt. Perhaps we were just more honest about our own depravities and more tolerant of other people's vices. And I should know, in 1928, vice in all its endless permutations was my departmental responsibility at the police presidium in Berlin's Alexanderplatz. Criminalistically speaking, which was a new word for us cops thanks to vice, I knew almost as much about the subject of vice as Gilles de Rais, but in truth, with so many dead in the Great War and the flu that came immediately after which, like some Old Testament plague, killed millions more, it hardly seemed important to worry about what people put up their noses or what they did when they got undressed in their dark, Biedermeier bedrooms. And not just in their bedrooms. On some nights, the tear garden sometimes looked like a stud farm. There were so many whores copulating on the grass with their clients. I suppose it's hardly surprising that after a war in which so many Germans were obliged to kill for their country, now they preferred to fuck. Given everything that went before and everything that followed, it's difficult to speak accurately or fairly about Berlin. In many ways, it was never a pleasant place, and sometimes a senseless, ugly one. Too cold in winter, too hot in summer, too dirty, too smoky, too smelly, too loud, and of course afflicted horribly, with far too many people, like Babel, which is the other name for Babylon. All the city's public buildings were constructed to the glory of a German empire that hardly even existed, and like the city's worst slums and tenements, made nearly everyone who encountered them feel inhuman and insignificant. Not that anyone ever cared much about Berlin's people, certainly its rulers didn't, since they were not very agreeable or friendly or well-mannered, Quite often they were stupid, heavy, dull, and relentlessly vulgar. Always they were cruel and brutal. And yet, for all that, Berlin was also a wonderful, inspiring place. Despite the many previously listed reasons to dislike the city, it was a large, bright mirror to the world, and hence, for anyone interested in living in that world, a marvellous reflection of human life in all its fascinating glory. I wouldn't have lived anywhere else but Berlin if you'd paid me, especially now that Germany was over the worst. After the Great War, the flu, and the inflation, things were getting better, albeit slowly. Things were still hard for a lot of people in the east of the city most of all. But it was difficult to see a Berlin ever going the same way as Babylon, which, according to the Conversations lexicon, was destroyed by the Chaldeans, its walls, temples, and palaces razed, and the rubble thrown into the sea. Something like that was never going to happen to us. Whatever followed now, we were probably safe for a biblical destruction. It wasn't in anyone's interest, not the French, not the British, and certainly not the Russians, to see Berlin, and by extension Germany, become the subject of divine, apocalyptic vengeance. Well, the confidence of the writing, the style, the dark sardonic humour, the irony, it is all there in that piece. And of course, set in 1928, so prophetic. It's a fantastic book, enjoy it. And I would now like to drink a toast to Metropolis. And buy it. It's not actually published till next week, but copies are on sale here, so buy it and have a treat in store. Here's to Philip and Metropolis. Yeah. And now I hand over to Jay.
Thank you so much, Jay. Now, you might be wondering tonight why you haven't been to that many Philip Kerr book launches before. And if you are wondering that, it's because he absolutely hated them. He'd say, if you have a book launch, all your so-called friends turn up, they drink all your wine, and then they never bother to buy the book. So I thought, what better commemoration? Have a lovely party, and you can drink as much wine as you can manage, and none of us are going to notice if you buy the book. Philip Larkin said, what will survive us is love. And I only have to look out at your faces here to know that's true. Philip was a very singular person who inspired great devotion, and many of you here, especially those who visited him when he was so ill, and lots of you who've come from a long way away, were very dear to him. But when you're a writer, what survives of you also is your books. And it has astonished me in the last year how many people have written from all over the world saying how much they love Bernie Gunther and how they're rereading the novels all over again. So in one way, as long as Bernie's around, Philip is around too, because although he adamantly denied it, it's quite obvious to me that Bernie had an awful lot in common, not least their invincibility. What makes Metropolis such an astonishing achievement is that it was conceived and written entirely while Philip knew that he was dying. In July 2017, he was told he had incurable cancer, and faced with the kind of sentence that most of us would reel from, instead he only redoubled his attention to his novel. He wrote every day. He wrote Saturday, Sunday, Christmas Day. He wrote in the chemotherapy suite. He was the most driven, focused, and productive writer I have ever known. He never tired of quoting a line from Iris Murdoch. When she was asked how long she left between novels, she said, a long time, at least 40 minutes. But what we all loved most about Philip, and indeed Bernie, was his sense of humour. Philip was a person of deep, rich, and wide-ranging prejudices. He hated, in no particular order, carol singers, Thought for the Day, Sephardian, women's football, pavement tables, Daunts outside cafes, David Jason, Liverpool, any Irish celebrity, Scots, except for Scottish beggars who he always rewarded handsomely, Harry Potter, launch parties I mentioned before. He joined the Labour Party just so he could have the pleasure of resigning from it. He loathed musicals. In Metropolis, Bernie remarks, "I never yet saw a musical I didn't think could be improved by a deeper pit for the orchestra, a bottomless chasm for the cast." Phil's humour was mordant, sentimental and angry, but in Bernie it was transmuted into magnificent golden prose. As in, "I'm no longer young enough, not quite thin enough to share a single bed with anything other than a hangover or a cigarette. If you're dead, then Vienna is probably the best place to be." Being a Berlin cop in 1942 was a little like putting down mouse traps in a cage full of tigers. Philip was hugely talented, kind, generous, unforgettable. But if you want to remember exactly what he was like, you only need to open one of his books. So thank you all so much for coming.
Until I met Philip, I never understood how women were able to find other men attractive. Another way of putting this is that Philip was the only man I ever found attractive. Let's not get ahead of ourselves. I didn't, in any of the more lurid senses of the phrase, lose my heart to Philip. But I found him companionable and courteous in a way I wasn't used to, and couldn't quite account for by reference to his undoubted intellectual and conversational gifts. Maybe it was his aftershave, or his shampoo, or the colour of his eyes, or his suits. Well, it was definitely his suits. He didn't dress like a writer. I so admired him for not dressing like a writer. Our friendship was always about to take off. We didn't meet as often as I anyway would have liked, and when we did meet, we'd say we must do this again, and then not do it again, sometimes for years. But it gave me immense pleasure just knowing he was out there. I smiled whenever I thought of him, and I laughed aloud in anticipated pleasure when he emailed to suggest a blokish lunch. Blokish. Who else could get away with that in our nervous times? The blokish lunches, when we managed to get around to arranging them, were not blokish in a way that anyone anti-blokish could have found offensive. We didn't roam the streets looking for trouble. We didn't proposition waitresses. We sat and ate and drank reasonably good wine. And our conversation wasn't scurrilous, though we were often rude about writers we knew, especially those with fancy prose styles who didn't wear suits. And we were rude about the decencies that were inch by inch confining our world. We didn't feel we had to be careful with each other. I remember him saying once, probably in the course of laying into Jeremy Corbyn, "It's not that I love Jews." I looked at him aghast. Philip? He threw his head back as though watching me preparing to take offence gave him as much pleasure as ordering another bottle of wine. He went on, "It's just that I love anti-Semites, just that little bit less." I was still looking aghast. "Philip, I'm quoting Bernie Gunther," he said. "You can hear what kind of writer he was in that. It's just that I love anti-Semites, that little bit less." Is the word for that metanoia? Maybe there isn't a word for it. Maybe it's just Philippic. Giving and taking all at once, tripping us up, seesawing our expectations. He was as a writer as he was as a conversationalist, always within the bounds of good manners. He was as both, but always within the bounds of good manners, someone who loved risking the curlicues of impropriety. So essentially, he seemed to me, as clearly he was to you, a comic writer. Coincidentally, on the very afternoon Jane asked me to speak in remembrance of Philip, I happened to be in a bookshop, not this one. I rarely go into bookshops. Few writers dare go into bookshops. I happened to be in that one. I queued behind someone buying a stack of thrillers, 2 of which were by Philip. "You know there's a new one coming out soon," the assistant said. "The customer did. I can't wait, he said. Having encountered a fellow enthusiast, the assistant burbled on. I interviewed him once in this shop, he said. He was great, but I was so surprised. All he wanted to talk about was the comedy in his work. Not the plotting, not the suspense, not Berlin, but the comedy. I feared he'd overdone it, and the customer would immediately return Philip's books to the shelves. Comedy's a word you have to go easy with. I like to think that Philip was pulling a fast one and passing off his books as something they weren't, or rather concealing what else they were. I once asked him if he'd ever thought of writing out-and-out comedy. I'll leave that to you, he said. You're the Bernard Manning de nos jours. I pulled my aghast face at him. Bernard Manning? Philip! Lights danced in his eyes, those beautiful, mocking eyes. Ah, I see. That's a Bernie Gunther line. Philip re-smiled his smile. Having thought about this since, I now realise how unlikely it was, both from a cultural and a historical point of view. Bernie Gunther would have known who Bernard Manning was. You bastard. What made him such good company was that he didn't pretend to warmth he didn't feel, or to fair-mindedness to those he couldn't abide, and there were many. There was not an ounce of sanctimony in Philip. In the course of a 3-hour lunch with him, you didn't have to pretend to a feeling or an opinion you didn't have. But beneath the mischief was the sadness of the sceptic. Intellectually, he was mistrustful of everything, including himself. Real wisdom is always subject to modesty, he emailed me once to say. This is the kind of email I got from Philip. Wasn't it Aristotle who said, the more I learn, the less I know? Sometimes I think of all the books I haven't read, which is most of them, and I think I am the most ignorant man in the world. It was like getting an email from Montaigne. But he hadn't finished. I think I am the most ignorant man in the world, but then I look at the others. He said once that he was struck by how many of the great writers were haunted by their past. Then he paused, as I am. Something happened, the wine came, I don't remember, but the subject changed and we never returned to it. Haunted, not preoccupied, not troubled, haunted. It's possible he wouldn't have taken it further, wine or no wine, not over lunch. He was exquisitely considerate. For all the merriment and mischief, he wanted to make the air still around you. I can't bear to think of him not here, but it quietens my heart and soothes my nerves and settles my spirits and makes me laugh to my soul to remember him. Can we raise another glass?